Rabbi Shmuel Hain is rabbi of Young Israel Ohab Zedek of North Riverdale, Yonkers, as well as Rosh Beit Midrash at SAR High School. Shmuel Hain is a rabbi, the son of a rabbi.
My father, when I was younger, was a rabbi of a small shul on the Upper East Side, congregation Rabbi Hain, and a big shift in our life occurred when he became the rabbi of a large congregation on Long Island, Beth Shalom.
So the apple didn't fall far from the tree when he decided to enter the rabbinate. Rabbi Hain learned invaluable lessons from his father that he was able to apply to his own career.
One of the things I learned from my father is that showing up for people and being there for people is just as important as the sermon.
But he's a different variety of apple, bringing his own flavor and unique style of sermon to the pulpit.
I had a taste of the larger rabbinates through my father, through rabbinic internships, through an assistant rabbi job. I have developed a much more conversational style.
Rabbi Hain has a very specific philosophy about the purpose of a drasha nowadays versus how it used to be a generation ago.
To me, the Drasha is in service of what you're trying to do as a rabbi to build your community. Whereas a generation ago, the Drasha was kind of the focal point.
So he's very intentional about the content and delivery of his sermon because to him, it's a springboard to connect with his congregants.
And I also use sermons and other educational settings to invite people to reach out.
But probably the most effort Rabbi Hain puts into his speaking is for the life cycle events, like at a bar or bat mitzvah.
The feedback I get is often after Shabbos, Rabbi, you really understood my kid. You really expressed who she was. You really got to the core of their personality. And that takes a lot of work.
Rabbi Hain is an expert in the Jewish laws of death and mourning. In this interview, he candidly describes his impetus for mastering those skills with knowledge and compassion.
8 or 9 years ago, we had a string of really difficult tragedies in the community, and my father-in-law passed away very suddenly, and my wife was sitting Shiva, and I just found that I didn't have all the tools.
We also discussed what the goal is of a successful eulogy.
It's supposed to kind of give this vivid description of who this person was for their loved ones and for others, and you have to take that seriously.
And the importance of being your authentic self with your congregation.
The people know who you are. They get a sense that you're being authentic pays dividends in the long run.
I learned so much from my interview with Rabbi Shmuel Hain, and I'm sure you will too. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rabbi Shmuel Hain.
I also, because my father was a shul rabbi, I kind of have this complex about being called Rabbi Hain, I guess. So
okay, right.
You know how people are always like,
who's he talking to?
Right, is my dad standing behind me? Yeah,
right. Okay, so let's use that as a springboard for the conversation because I had a couple questions about that. I'm always fascinated when I see rabbis whose sons become rabbis and follow in their footsteps. And that was the case with you and also your brother, right? Your brother's a rabbi as well?
Yes.
So I'm wondering how much your father's career path influenced your choice of profession.
It's a great question, and obviously it has an impact in conscious and subconscious ways. Both me and my brother are rabbis, but what's interesting is that we are not in the same exact aspect of the rabbinate or branch of the rabbinate that my father ended up in. My father, when I was younger, was a rabbi of a small shul on the Upper East Side, congregation Rabbi Hain, and I have extremely fond memories of that period of our life. Basically until I was in 7th grade. It was a small shul, and my father also had time to hang out in Central Park with us and, do things on weekends. And a big shift in our life occurred when he became the rabbi of a large congregation on Long Island, Beit Shalom, which for him was very much professionally fulfilling. And I remember being happy for him as his son who wanted him to achieve what he wanted to do in the rabbinate. He had been a rabbi in Houston and came back to New York and was really looking to be a rabbi of a large synagogue. That was his skill set. and his interests. And so I was really excited for him when that happened. And I wasn't upset about moving. My younger brother was, my older sisters were, but I was kind of living vicariously through him. And I didn't realize at the time that that shift to Lawrence would represent a kind of changing of the dynamic of our household. Like it became very much a 24/7 rabbinic household in a way that it hadn't been until then. And I think because of that, me and my brother have chosen, we saw the value of communal service, of Avodat HaKodesh, but we also didn't necessarily want to do the exact same kind of rabbinate that our father did. So my brother is a very successful campus professional. He's the rabbi of the Columbia Barnard Hillel at the Craft Center there, and he's been doing that for a long time, and the last few months have been quite challenging for him. And I always wanted to be kind of a combination educator and shul rabbi, and always thought of myself as doing both those things, kind of high level teaching of Torah, specifically teaching of Gemara, and also a smaller kind of shul, a community kind of shul. And I had a taste of the larger rabbinates through my father, through rabbinic internships, through an assistant rabbi job, and really found this particular shul and this particular community to be the right fit for me and for us as a family.
Amazing. What are your maybe some memories that stand out from your father speaking? Watching him as a kid address the congregation every Shabbos morning from the pulpit. What are some things that stand out to you?
Yeah, so that's also an excellent question, and I have real vivid memories of that. I would say I kind of have two influences, primary influences in terms of public speaking and drashot and shiurim in a shul context. So first, of course, is my father. My father never or rarely wrote sermons out. He had notes. He always had like scrap papers, envelopes, all kinds of things where he would write notes. And he was also really collaborative. Rabbi J.J. Schachter, Rabbi Baruch Taub, and other rabbis were some of the rabbis that he was always on the phone with, working on drashot with. He was an excellent extemporaneous speaker. He also has something that you're just born with. In his heyday, he was 6'4" and had this incredibly booming voice. And that gave him a big part of his strength as a speaker, because he would almost always build to some kind of crescendo with that booming voice, the voice of God, also influenced by some preacher style type of speaking. And I would say that he had a formula, but was not formulaic. I detected or could sense that there were certain kinds of notes that he was trying to hit. But the drashot that I remember the most from my childhood are the ones that have had the deepest impact on my style and my choices. And those are ones that weren't necessarily high holiday, booming voice to 800 members in a congregation. They were more personal. And I still remember a drasha in Beth Shalom when he was there for 5 or 6 years, where he opened up with, I want to talk to you this morning about my salary. And you could feel the little bit of buzz in the audience. And he would then, he developed a piece of Torah and told a different story. And each time, kind of each chapter of the 15 to 20-minute drasha, he would conclude by saying, remember, I got to come back to my salary at the end of this. And the point of the drasha and the Torah was to talk about fulfillment that he had as a rabbi, and the importance of valuing Jewish educators and Jewish communal professionals and rabbis. And the last piece of it was, my salary's okay, and my salary's pretty good. And so if you're worried about your children entering into Avodat HaKodesh, you shouldn't worry so much. You can make a life in it. You can be successful. So that's the kind of thing that I remember. I also remember Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol, where he would present kind of Rabbi Soloveitchik style halachic and agadic, kind of both legal material and homiletics drush that would usually converge and emerge one from the other. And that was also something that I was particularly taken with. So adding the personal element and also investing time in certain drasha. And what I also got from him is, and I've spent more time on this, is making sure people know that you've spent a lot of time on it. So I before Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol, I will talk about it several weeks in advance, and people know that I've prepared for it and have thought a lot about it, and I'm delivering Torah and a message that I think our community really needs to hear.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the ways that some of the things that you modeled from your father that you picked up, and some of the ways that maybe you forged a different path?
Right. So the other influence I had, which I didn't get back to, was I was at the Jewish Center for 2 years. And in that space, it was very much the culture to have everything written out. So much so that when I first got there, I was not comfortable doing it. And Rabbi Ari Berman, who's now the president of YU, who was the senior rabbi, I was the assistant rabbi, he was like, you need to learn how to do this. This is, even if it's not the style that you settle on, that's what they're used to here. And it's another, tool in your chest for you to be able to utilize. And I appreciate that. And I think he was right. But part of that, both my father's style and the Jewish Center, which were these kind of more formal preacher, hierarchical kind of styles of speaking, were based on the architecture. The Jewish Center and the Beth Shalom pulpit, and even my father's pulpit in Rabbi Hain, were like 10, 12 feet up from the audience, and you are preaching down to the people. And both the Jewish Center and my father's influences and styles were very much one way and top down kind of imagery and speaking style. And I think the thing that I've forged in my shul, and it was originally because my shul, we've now built a beautiful new shul, which has a slight 3-step up bima, where a lectern where I speak from, but it's still kind of very warm and almost a living room like. I have developed a much more conversational style, a much more we're talking, and I'm sharing with you the ideas that I'm thinking about, and I want to hear from you what you're thinking, and I've even invited, or it even invites some audience participation sometimes. And I think that's kind of the biggest difference between what I saw growing up and what I saw in my early years as an assistant rabbi, and kind of the style that I've developed in my shul, which is we're on this journey together. We're building this community. The community was very small when I got there. It was maybe 60 families. We're now at about 150 families, but even the design of our new shul, we did some stadium seating in the back because I wanted it to feel like everyone was a little bit on top of each other, so that there was that kind of warm feeling where we're all in this together. One of the things I learned from to me, the drasha is in service of what you're trying to do as a rabbi to build your community. Whereas a generation ago, the drasha was kind of the focal point of many people's rabbinates. Fathers, that showing up for people and being there for people is just as important as the sermon. And I think that's become even, inverted further in the last 25 years, where being there for people, helping people feel connected, not feeling lonely, knowing that there's a community for them and a rabbi and a rabbi's family that cares about them. That's kind of the main focus of my rabbinate, and that has influenced my style of speaking and the themes that I'll discuss in the Drasha.
Interesting. So I'm curious about a couple things that you just spoke about. At the Jewish Center, when you said that the kind of the theme of the drasha was to have it written out, more scripted. Did that mean that you read from the notes, or just it was more prepared, or it was more polished?
I couldn't memorize. I didn't have the patience to memorize and to present a memorized speech. There were some times where I, was reading or loosely reading, or there were some times where I wrote it out and then kind of went off script. At the Jewish Center, not just the physical distance, the history. My favorite stories are language was so important there. So you had to write it out because they expected you to have turns of phrases, which are almost impossible to do in real time. And extemporaneously, you can write a few of them out, but to have the language be so sharp and so on point, in the Jewish Center, when you come off the bima at the end of davening during Adon Olam, you run to the back door so that you can shake everyone's hand on the way out, which is a nice custom, and it's again the rabbi-centric element of the shul is that the rabbis then go to the back, and as you're shaking everybody's hand, there's a comment about the sermon. Almost everyone has a great sermon, Rabbi, or this sermon, but you also get, Rabbi, the words chasm, not chasm, or it's the great Max Weber, not Max Weber. I had read things, and I was had a vocabulary that maybe was more from reading than from actually hearing. And so I'd get all kinds of feedback about pronunciation and other kinds of things. That's just the culture of the shul. But I did more reading then. And there are still times today where I will write out speeches. Sometimes for shul dinners because I want to be short and get to the point. Sometimes on high holidays. But my spouse, Sherry, has this observation that I tend to write out one of the speeches like on Rosh Hashanah and one of the speeches on Yom Kippur, and like Yizkor and Yom Kippur and the first day of Rosh Hashanah, invariably, and then I speak a bunch of other times. I can't write out 6 speeches, and we still thankfully have one big minyan as opposed to during COVID we had multiple minyanim, but now that we're post-COVID and our shul has expanded, we're able to have one minyan. So I'm giving 6 talks over the high holidays. You can't write them all out, especially I have a full-time job teaching on the side. And she always points out that the ones that I've written out, even though the language might be crisper, it's usually flatter. It usually doesn't have the same kind of impact as the one that I spent less time worrying about every single word, and that's because I'm doing some reading. And the shul and most people are used to me speaking extemporaneously and sharing kind of things that are going on in my life or things that I'm thinking. I do very few like canned jokes or borrowed material from joke books or openers that some other rabbi use, just because the style that I have is to bring things that I've been listening to or that I was impressed by or stories that happened to me to the pulpit, because it's kind of this ongoing conversation and the things that I'm thinking about with the community.
Yeah. When you're talking about the divide between the rabbi, the sermon was kind of like the highlight of the rabbi's position, whereas now it seems in this generation, it seems more it's like the pastoral part, it takes a much more prominent place. Who was doing all of that, the counseling and all the servicing of the congregants, the one-to-one stuff back then? What was it still the rabbi? Was he doing both at the same time, or was it
I think there was less of that a generation or two ago than there is now. I think people are more open about discussing the different kinds of things that are going on in their lives with rabbis. And and to me, it's also a function of I have another full-time job as an educator, and so something's got to give, and so I don't do a ton of classes during the week, and I don't have a typed out 12-minute to 14-minute sermon every week. I only speak if I have something to say, but I also vary what I do. I would say I give like a classic sermon no more than twice a month. I'll give a mini shir. I'll give more of a Dvar Torah type of thing. That I vary. My community happens to be one that is diverse, but it's highly sophisticated. Whether it's Jewishly knowledgeable, which many of them are. I have many educators and many Jewish academics, but even the people who have less of a background are really professionals and the kinds of people who value intellectually challenging kind of material. So I'll give a Dvar Torah which pushes people to look at a pasuk or a Torah concept or a broader theme from a different perspective, and not necessarily offer the practical applications that a classic sermon will have, or a mini shir following services, and then Shabbos Shuvah and Shabbos Hagadol, which are kind of semi-annual or biannual highlights where it's a real learning / state of the union community kind of presentation. And so for me, I vary those things because the interests of my congregants are that. And I also use sermons and other educational settings to invite people to reach out on a whole host of issues. I'll give you one example of this. When I first came to my shul, it was an older congregation, a lot of empty nesters. I was 29 years old. And I noticed that people weren't coming to me to talk about pastoral stuff. My predecessor didn't prioritize that. He was more of a scholar type. And I came up with this idea with my wife to do a series of Friday night onegs where we invited 5 or 6 couples at a time. And it wasn't just to hang out with them, where we did a text study and that led to a conversation. But the theme of the study was about adult kids and the challenges of adult kids. So what I did was I took the parable of the prodigal son from the New Testament and I compared it with Yaakov's admonitions and brachot, his blessings to his kids on his deathbed. And why I chose that was it gave the people who are in attendance the sense that, oh, this young rabbi who's 30 years old is thinking through the issues that we're dealing with. And after that series of Friday night onegs, I found that people were approaching me about different challenges they were having with their kids because I had invited them to be able to see that I was thinking about it. So that also helped me really understand early on, 15, 16 years ago at this shul, that I want people to engage with me on the stuff that they're really dealing with, I need to also signal to them that I'm thinking about it and that I welcome that and that I'm ready to be engaged on that, even if I don't have the life experience that maybe they think is required to be able to sort through those things. So that's true of Drasha as well, like what topic you pick and what kinds of things you share, and having a child go through challenge with mental illness and sharing that with their permission in that setting is a way for people to realize that you're thinking about things that they're thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Did you speak yesterday?
I did.
Okay, so let's use yesterday as a great example. Fresh off the paper, or extemporaneous. So walk me through what you spoke about, and maybe through the background of how it ended up coming to be that.
So it's really funny because I actually spoke before laning unexpectedly, and then I spoke in the Drasha slot. And the reason why I spoke before laning, yesterday was my bar mitzvah parsha. It was Va'era, and
happy birthday.
I always have a problem with Va'era of kind of excavating some kind of newer way of looking at it, because I know it so well. I laned it on my bar mitzvah. I practically have it memorized. the words are too familiar. And yesterday, we have a Hashkama minyan, and I often lane at both the Hashkama and at the later regular minyan. And the Gabbai asked me this year, do you want to lane at both? I said, you know what? I'm not sure if I want to go to Hashkama. I usually give a Dvar Torah at the end. Let me just lane at the later one. But my son was doing youth groups, and he wanted to go to Hashkama, so I went with him. And in listening to the laning and not laning it myself, I noticed something that I had never noticed. And so this became my pre-laning observation, which I introduced by sharing what I just shared with you, that this came to me thanks to our Gabbai who gave me the morning off from laning. In the opening psukim, as Hashem is telling Moshe to keep on going, there's a double phrasing of Vigam. Vigam hakimosi es brisi itam laseis lahem es haaretz Canaan, referring to the covenant. I established that covenant with Avram at Bris Ben Absarim and with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Vigam ani shamati es na'akas b'nei Yisrael asher Mitzrayim avidu amosam. Back-to-back psukim uses that word Vigam. And if you look at Brit Bein HaBtarim, the covenant of the parts, where Avram receives that promise, it says, Vigam et hagoy dan anochi. It uses that same word, Vigam, to signal that part of the covenant is that you're going to be enslaved, you're going to be oppressed, and then you're going to go out, and you're going to go out. And what I pointed out is that the second Vigam adds a dimension that we wouldn't necessarily have thought. Hashem could have just said, V'gam hakimoti et briti, with Avram, with Yitzchak, with Yaakov, v'ezkor et briti, I remember the bris. But God, that would have been sufficient. But God adds, V'gam ani shamati et na'akat b'nei Yisrael. I hear the moaning and the groans and the crying out of the Israelite people. And I said that shows that even though God, of course, fulfills the covenant because that's the idea of covenant. God always says what God's going to do. God always fulfills what God's going to do. There's another element here where God is making good because there's been an impact of our cries, of our tefillot. V'gam ani shamati et na'akat b'nei Yisrael. And then I related it to the moment that we're in now, 100 days after the events of October 7th and the hostages that are still there. And sometimes we feel like our tefillot are futile and it hasn't done anything. But the idea is God has made a promise to us, but beyond that promise, God also indicates in the beginning of Va'era that our tefillot do make a difference, do have some kind of impact, as it were, moves God to act in history in this way. So that was the intro, and the sermon itself. I had been listening. I over the summer I listened to an interesting oral history on WNYC, New York radio, public radio, where they did the Brian Lehrer listened to oral histories of callers. People would call in, starting with people in their 90s to in their 20s, where they would share the event in their lifetime that shaped their values, shaped who they are. And some of them are the usual suspects, Pearl Harbor and the Holocaust and Kennedy assassination. But some of them were different events, and each one of them was really interesting. And I encouraged people to listen to the program, and I compared that to God's revelation of the name Yud Kei Vav Kei, even though it doesn't seem to be all that new. It had been used previously, but the idea being that each generation has kind of its own challenges and relationship with God, and in order to be shaped by history, we have to actually shape history ourselves. And talked a little bit about how Moshe is the one who does that and is the role model for us. And now that we're 100 days past this momentous event, this horrific event, the questions we need to start asking ourselves are the questions that Moshe was asking. Like, what do we do? How do we figure out how to move forward? How do we make sure that this event doesn't just pass, but we use it to shape the way we live our lives in a meaningful kind of way? That was Parshat Va'era 5784.
Yeah. And so obviously the situation in Israel is on everybody's mind, so that's probably taking up a lot of
Yeah.
sermon space.
Yeah, I also have a lot of congregants who have family there. I have a ton of family there. I have two kids who are there now, and one who lives there permanently, and lots of family, nephew serving in
Yeah,
Gaza at the moment, and lots of people in my shul have a lot of direct, one step removed connections to Israel. We
right.
even had three shlichim here that all went back to serve, and some of them have come back since then. Some of the husbands have come back after serving for a couple of months.
Yeah, so there's a very strong connection. So how did the WNYC that theme work its way in? Was that something that
I
percolated?
opened I opened with that and talked about kind of why it made an impression on me, why I thought it was powerful to listen to this. But then I kind of used that and said, okay, when God introduces himself as Shem Hashem, it also seems like this kind of momentous event. What makes it momentous? How did Moshe precipitate it? And then kind of used the Torah from the beginning of Parshat Va'era to reflect on this particular moment that we're in now. That was kind of the three parts. The opener, the transition to the Dvar Torah, and then the application, each of which kind of partook of that idea of like living through history, recognizing you're living through history, experiencing those moments as an opportunity to kind of examine your values and live your life informed by those values, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. How do you decide what to speak about on a given week? I mean, let's say it wasn't, the Israel situation right now, which is obviously taking over everything, but how do you decide?
So that's a very good question. I don't have like a specific formula. There's sometimes where there are things that I'm thinking about in terms of the community that is an important issue that I'll decide I need to speak about, and then I'll try to seek out some Torah that helps develop that idea, whether it's unity. When I came to my shul, there was a lot of different factions in the shul. They had gone through one round um, of rabbinic tryouts, and it had not gone anywhere. They couldn't form a consensus. I had not been involved at that stage. They recruited me, and there was a lot of healing that needed to be done. So I think the first 2 years in the shul, 3 years in the shul, like pretty much every other drasha was about arvut, how to live with differences with one another. I wasn't even necessarily all that successful because at some point, one of the prominent members of the shul decided to start their own shul. But I think pushing certain themes are the kinds of things that always speak to people. And then sometimes it's just something that I'm thinking about or something that's on my head that I want to challenge them to think about. And sometimes it's just Torah. And that's why, like, if I don't feel like I have a drasha theme to discuss, I will not give a drasha. I will just learn something with the community, which hopefully is informative and hopefully gets them to think and challenges them, but isn't necessarily like, here are your three practical takeaways from this sermon. And so I don't force it. And I'm in a community which doesn't expect to have it. I also will vary when I speak. I usually will reserve the drasha slot for a more conventional sermon and then do like a post-davening mini shear slot for so even that signals what kind of speech that they're getting. And so they can settle in. And sometimes I'll do a couple of sources with a mini shear. So once the paper start passing around, they're like, okay, this is going to be, I'm going to have to focus a little bit on this text. It's not, I don't need to think about, I still want to get them engaged from the moment that I open my mouth, but it's going to be a different kind of talk. I also want to mention one other thing that I think is crucial. I don't know if other rabbis have mentioned this to you. I find now that the sermons or the talks on Shabbat morning that I give the most thought to or that are the most important are in connection with a simcha. and trying to find the right message where you show the kid, the family, the parents. Most feedback I get, unlike in the Jewish Center where every week there was like a report card from the congregants with immediate feedback. Now the feedback I get is often after Shabbos. Rabbi, you really understood my kid. You really expressed who she was. You really got to the core of their personality, and that takes a lot of work. I meet with the children before their bar bat mitzvah. We have everyone in the shul in our home for meals. So in order to do that well, you have to know kids. You have to talk to people who know them if sometimes they're a little bit harder to get to know. And then you have to craft the right Dvar Torah that's not generic, that actually fits that individual's personality. And I think that's really a big part of where you see the convergence of the pastoral communal building and the sermonizing is in those particular moments, in those particular kinds of talks. I spend a good deal of time thinking about that, and I teach now at our local high school, so it gives me the opportunity to see kids in this other context and really get to know them as not just their rabbi, but also as kind of a teacher in the school.
Yeah. So let me, I was going to ask you this a little bit later, but I think it's a good springboard. So I noticed that you teach the laws of mourning, Hilchos Avelos.
Right.
So tell me about how that has influenced eulogizing. Tell me how you approach a eulogy, which also is really important to be specific and not generic. I remember my grandfather when he passed away. There was a chaplain there, and he asked the whole family a couple questions, and within about 20 minutes, he had come slap together a eulogy, and it just seems so canned and just missed the mark. But what I'd like to hear from you, it sounds like you're very intentional about how you approach, at least for a simcha. So how do you approach a eulogy?
Okay, that's a great question. So first of all, in terms of Avelis, it emerged somewhat from what I was doing in the rabbinate and what was going on in my personal life. About 8 or 9 years ago, we had a string of really difficult tragedies in the community, and my father-in-law passed away very suddenly, and my wife was sitting Shiva, and I just found that I didn't have all the tools to do it. I was also not doing my job as a spouse. I didn't want to treat my wife as a congregant. So instead of like being more engaged with her, I kind of withdrew. It was a time where she was very helpful in getting me to see that I wasn't doing the right thing. And I even did some therapy to kind of figure out what was going on at that particular moment. And since then, I've been teaching Hilchos Avelos to Smicha students. And I was lucky enough to do a fellowship at Harvard for a semester, where I spent a lot of time researching and writing now about it. And you're right, the eulogy is really something critical. I'll share a thought. The Shulchan Aruch starts off the Siman in Shulchan Aruch about eulogies, about Hespedim, by saying mitzvah gedola. It's a great mitzvah to be maspid a person. And the Shulchan Aruch only uses that term in 2 other places when he talks about lending to the poor, halva laniyim, and pidyon shvuyim. Those are the 3 places where the Shulchan Aruch uses the terminology mitzvah gedola. And I think in each of those instances, what you're really doing is an act that brings a person back to life. Ani chashuv kames, a poor person in Jewish tradition is thought in some ways as someone who is not fully alive. When you lend them, you give them a sense of hope and purpose and opportunity. Obviously, pidyon shvuyim, bringing someone back from a hostage situation. But that's really what the hesped is supposed to do as well. It's supposed to kind of give this vivid description of who this person was for their loved ones and for others. And you have to take that seriously. You can't exaggerate too much, because then that's not who that person was. you can't overlook some of the unique characteristics of that person, because again, then you're not capturing the unique essence and the unique story of that individual. I love this line in a poem: "Death steals everything except our stories." Like the essence of a person and who they are, you can continue to tell that story, and that's really what a hesped in its highest form is supposed to be about, to try to capture who that person was and their life story in a meaningful way, in a way that ideally kind of reflects some kind of Torah or Jewish value, and doing that requires effort and knowing people. And there will be times where the family is doing 10 different hespedim, and I always speak last at funerals, and I'm prepared to not speak at all. Like, if the family has really captured the person, I will just wrap up and say, this has been an amazing insight into this individual's life and the impact that they had. I'll make sure I have a list of like different things that I want to make sure gets discussed and mentioned, and throughout the funeral I'll kind of check them off, and if they're all hit, I Tzimtzum is really important as a rabbi, is to just move it along, and that's fine. But then I've been at funerals where the family said they're going to have 5 or 6 speakers, and then a couple of the people were too emotional, and a couple other people didn't show up, and you then need to kind of really share who this person was, and you have to speak for 15 or 20 minutes. Otherwise, it's going to be a 12-minute funeral. So in those cases, you really need to do a deeper dive and be prepared to go into it. So the key is, I think, to try to be prepared, to try to do your best to kind of match the Torah to who that person was, and like you said, to not be canned, to really try to come up with something unique. It's hard. One of the advantages of being in a smaller shul is you get to know people better. You get to connect with them. I don't have 15 or 20 funerals a year. It's much more in the 5 to 10 range. And congregants passing away is rarer than that. And so trying to figure out ways to really express the unique story and who that person was is what the hesped is all about.
Mm-hmm. And often you don't always have a lot of time to prepare.
Right. So you got to sometimes you can sit down with the family and get a sense if they're going to be able to handle it, or if they're going to need you to do it. And sometimes, like I said, I'm always prepared with like 5 or 6 or 7 different ideas, and maybe with different Torahs connected with each of them, so that I can then keep a tab during the other members of the family, when they're speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you have like your own unique relationship with that person that the family members don't know all about, of course that's something that's particularly helpful. I had a congregant who when we switched to Art Scroll, he wanted the Chumash. He kept the Hertz Chumash. So at his funeral, I spoke about the Hertz Chumash and what the Hertz Chumash was about, and how that captured a big part of who he was. Having those kinds of very specific detail kinds of elements which capture who the person is, that's what the family remembers, and that's really, again, bringing that person to life in perpetuity, and making sure that the family members now have a image of who they knew, and they can love that person now that person's no longer with them, but the image of that person and the best version of that person, which you've helped hopefully construct.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you teach Judaic studies at a high school, SAR. Tell me some of the key differences between addressing teenagers and addressing adults. And I'm talking not necessarily inside when you address the teenagers, not necessarily in a classroom environment. If you ever have to give a presentation to them, how do you differ your style when you're presenting to young adults versus people later stages in their life?
I don't think I change that much. I'm fortunate that I teach mostly 11th and 12th grade, and I run a kollel, a Beit Midrash program. So I'm also teaching adults in that setting. And our high school, SAR High School, is very much a believer in kind of treating teenagers, giving them more credit than maybe they deserve in terms of their maturity and sophistication, but with the hope that if you treat them like adults, they will act more like adults. But I don't think I perform. I think kind of the theme that I would say traces its way through all of these conversations is that I'm trying to be myself and share with kids and with adults the things that I'm struggling with, or the things that I'm thinking about, or the insights, the exciting Torah that I just kind of clicked in my head. And I have found that with teenagers, they relate to that too. They even more so, they see when you're performing and when you're not being completely real. It's also exhausting to kind of have a persona for your public speaking, and then that not be who you are. And I once had a friend when we were in the rabbinate in our early years together, and we both had young kids. He called me up once and he was like, by the time I get home from Kiddush, I collapse and I have to take a nap for 2 hours. And my wife is resentful because she's watching the kids and she's tired. Like, are you struggling with that? And in the course of the conversation, I realized that part of what was hard for him is that he was performing the whole time, like every second in shul, even at Kiddush, when he was talking to people, he was performing, he was on, and that had such like an emotional and physical drain on him that he couldn't keep, he couldn't have, it sapped all of his energy. And if I wasn't totally conscious of it before that, that kind of crystallized for me the importance of like being who you are, and not feeling a sense that you have to perform, because the mental energy that takes can really be exhausting. And there's prices to that. Like, again, I don't necessarily feel like every single time I give a drasha, if someone is hearing me that one time, they'll walk away with like, that was the most profound, impactful, most incredible speaker I've ever seen. I think they'll say, okay, that was an interesting thought, that some interesting applications. There was some thought that was put into that. But I think over time, and with members of a community that you're trying to grow with, and you're trying to inspire them, and you're trying to really show that you're on this journey with them, that marathon pacing of public speaking style pays dividends in the long run. The people know who you are. They get a sense that you're being authentic, and that there isn't kind of a performative element to the speaking. Again, I get animated. I will tell a story in a way that's dramatic, but it's not like an out of body experience where when I come home, my family's like, who was that guy up there? It's always kind of me sharing the Torah and the ideas and the things that I'm thinking about or that happened to me.
Yeah. I'm curious, because you have an academic background, you spent time at Harvard. How it doesn't sound like that's influenced your choice of flowery language and sophisticated type of architecture of Divrei Torah and things like that. How did you manage to stay kind of down to earth while being in that academic world? Having that umbrella of academia around you.
That's a good question too. I try to do both. I have lots of interests, and so sometimes the language that I use will be, or the sources that I draw from will be more academic, but I won't assume that people are familiar with that. So I'll explain what that is. If I talk about Chet Egel and mention syncretism, I'll explain that syncretism means that maybe the sin of the golden calf was believing that God there is a God, but that there are other gods who also contribute. So the academic word for that is syncretism, and I'll use that in language because I do think that I have congregants who will appreciate that, and because I appreciate that. But I don't assume that everyone has access to that. And I also, like last night, I went to see American Fiction, which is this new movie that just came out, which is super interesting, and which I assume this is the other kind of downside of the rabbinate is like you can't help but always be looking for stuff for drushos and talks and other kinds of things. It's a little bit of a drag sometimes. You have to like put it away and not be too conscious of it because then it does seem like you're just walking around looking for experiences to use in a sermon as opposed to living life. But yeah, because I have eclectic interests and do try to give a range of talks, I will I'll sprinkle, some academic kinds of thinking and but I at my core, I think you picked up on that I'm not highfalutin or ivory tower. One of the things that I've written about is kind of how Torah Lishma doesn't have to only mean ivory tower, base medrash scholarship. It can also be translated, I saw this, another rabbi use this term as Torah for its intended purpose. Torah Lishma doesn't just mean like pure, unadulterated Torah for its own sake. It means Torah for its ultimate purpose, for its intended purpose, which is to impact people's lives and to help people grapple with the questions that they're thinking about, and when it's loss and bereavement, or whether it's a crisis of faith or whatever it is. So for me, that bridge of the scholarship and the real world is one of the things that I try to bring to my rabbinate and to my talks.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a little bit earlier about how you'll share some personal things that you may be going through. What are your guidelines, boundaries that you have for that? Have you ever crossed them? Has there ever been any family fallout from that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. People always look at my wife when I start a story and assume that she's heard the drasha beforehand. She's never heard the drasha beforehand. If there's something particularly sensitive, I will speak to my family members beforehand. But usually it's more playful, or I'm the butt of the joke. My family members invariably get praised. Probably the most memorable, and the one where I mentioned my dad's sermon about his salary. So my brother got married about 15 years ago, and my father was Masader Kedushin, and I was reading the Ketubah. And my sister-in-law is a scholar in her own right, Dr. Lana Stein-Hain, and I taught her at Stern at the time. I was teaching in the graduate Talmud program at Stern, and they asked me to read the Ketubah. And I had, at the time, my son, I think, was 6 years old, and I wanted to dance with my brother and sister-in-law, so I gave him the Ketubah and said, put it under the chuppah. And so I tell this story that we walk down, and we look under the chuppah, and there's no Ketubah. And my son was walking last because he was, the children always go last. So I am freaking out, bugging out completely. It was my job to hold on to the ketubah after the chasen's tish, to bring it to the chuppah, to read it, and it's nowhere to be found. And we're going crazy, and my son comes down, and I'm trying to control my rage and whatever it is, and I'm like, Eitan, where's the ketubah? And he said, it's under the chuppah. I said, under the chuppah, and there was about a 12-inch platform that the chuppah had been placed on, and he had slid the ketubah literally under the chuppah. And it was now located right underneath the chuppah. It was like 15 feet away from any access point with this 12-inch platform. So I tell that story and just drop it right there. I don't say what happens in the end. And this was way back earlier on in my time in the shul. And I had congregants call out, well, what happened? As I then transitioned to the Dvar Torah piece, it ended up being a discussion of, it was Parshat Yitro about Har Sinai and unity and working together and other kinds of things. The story was better than the Torah that week. But again, those are the kinds of things that, I end up being the parent who's exasperated and who gave responsibility to a 6-year-old, which was completely inappropriate. And so they tend to be, nothing that reveals sensitive information. Friday night, I sometimes give a Dvar Halacha, and I got a call once right before Shabbos from somebody who was driving from New Haven to Riverdale, and they realized they weren't going to make it. And so they were asking me, what do they do? And I started off by saying, my phone was buzzing as I was in the shower, and I got out of the shower and I picked up the phone, and my kids that Friday night at the dinner table were like, so were you in the shower when you got this call? So I also have a family members that will call me out when I'm maybe sharing too much information. So I've tried to learn how to properly navigate that, and I haven't made any terrible mistakes in terms of oversharing on that front. They're usually just kind of the humorous, hapless Shmuel Hain stories more than anything else.
Got it. Okay, I know we're almost out of time. I want to ask you maybe two pieces of advice that you would give a new rabbi fresh out of school, ready to get behind the pulpit. What advice would you give that rabbi?
So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I really think the most important job of a pulpit rabbi in the 21st century is to figure out exactly what the community needs and what your role is in shaping the growth of that community. And that'll depend on the personality of the individual rabbi and the state of that community. And so for me, building community, connecting people with each other and to God and to Torah and to Jewish peoplehood and to Israel, creating a shul community where that can happen. The number one piece of advice I would give is, what role does your weekly drasha play and your other talks play in achieving that ultimate goal of building out your particular community? And the second piece of advice I would say is, what's worked for me is more misdirection, less formulaic. Figure out ways to demand that the audience is paying attention from the very beginning. And obviously this has probably been influenced by, developments in popular culture as well, where stories are now told in less linear fashion. So I'll begin sometimes with a detailed story and leave out the ending and only return to it at the end after developing the drasha, or pose a question on a Torah first and then talk about the idea that I've been struggling with, to avoid kind of the one formula manner of speaking. I think is something that people nowadays really need. So figuring out who your community is and tailoring your drashas to that, and also making sure that you don't just stick with one formula. I think those are the two pieces of advice when it comes to sermons that I would give to young rabbis starting out. We need more of them. So I would encourage them to. That's one of the things I feel like since COVID. I think before COVID, I would sometimes, like, in my head be like critical of rabbis, or why can't this rabbi do that, or why can't this person be better at that? And one of the things for me that changed during COVID is I've just appreciate every single rabbi and educator and person who's an avodas hakodesh, who's giving of themselves. We're all flawed, but we're all trying to do this work in a way that can be helpful to other people, and I really admire that and respect that across the board.
Yeah, well, it comes across. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my short time as interim rabbi taught me a new appreciation and a respect for congregational leaders. So
it's really hard work, and it involves your whole family. Like my shul, we don't have an area. It's expensive to live here. They're cheaper options. There are other areas in Riverdale that are more popular. We really needed to build our community one family at a time, and that involved my whole family. The number of Shabbos meals we have with guests is really hard to fathom, but that's really how I found we built the community. So it's a credit to my kids and especially to my spouse for kind of helping to build our shul. And I think that's a part that people don't realize. Like sometimes you think, okay, I give a drasha and I give shiurim and I'm there for people pastorally. I think people want to feel connected to a shul family. And, part of the reason why Chabad has been so successful is because they've really tapped into that idea. And we joke sometimes that our shul, I'm a Yeki Litvak, but our shul kind of does have a little bit of that feel in the sense that, my kids were always helping move the Sidurim and Machzorim, and we're always hosting people and trying to connect different people in the community who have kids who have overlapping interests, or people in the community who just moved in. We're trying to connect them with people who we think they'd be friends with, and that kind of orchestrating is what community building is about, and that's like so not connected with the drashas and the shiurim and even the pastoral counseling. That's the wear and tear on the family.
You've been listening to The Maggid Method, and I'm Daniel Steinberg. Learn more about the Maggid Method at maggidmethod.com. There's a secret that great public speakers know. Did you know there's a method for cutting straight through to an audience's heart, grabbing their attention and holding it, and making a memorable impact with your presentation? The best speakers in the world utilize it, and now you can too, every time you get up to speak. Download your free Maggid Method of Public Speaking template at maggidmethod.com, maggidmethod.com. The Maggid Method will teach you how to find your authentic voice, craft meaningful presentations, manage people's attention, and build unbreakable bonds with your audience. Go to maggidmethod.com and download your free copy now.